right, we have a great lineup for you tonight, and it is my great pleasure and honor, where is he, to introduce Dr. James Halpern. There he is. Okay. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychology and founding director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. Played a lead role as a disaster mental health responder in the immediate aftermath of Newtown. He has also provided direct service to disaster survivors and served in leadership roles at both large and small-scale national and local disasters, including 9/11, Flight 587, the Florida hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, and the Harlem building explosion. Please welcome Dr. James Halpern.
I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about my personal experience and then lay out some basic facts that I feel like over the weeks has become so much part of the conversation. I've done a lot of disaster work, and a lot of that work was with the Red Cross. Being on scene immediately after the event occurs, nothing prepared me for my experience at Sandy Hook. And many of us remember where we were when we got that news. My wife, who's here today, I said, is it okay if I go? I'm going to need some support to be able to do that. I got her support from colleagues, had a self-care plan, but again, it was an event that attacked our imaginations. I had an opportunity, and it was an honor, I have to say, to speak with parents, grandparents, and siblings of 6-year-olds who were executed and murdered. I think that those families and others are sometimes described as strong and resilient, and they are. But I think it's important for us all to know, and I'm sure most of you do know this, that they weren't, they aren't, and they won't be okay. The community and those families are still grieving. The horror of those events linger. I have to say, when Parkland occurred, I thought, I can't believe that this is becoming normal. I didn't have the same reaction to Parkland that I did to Newtown, because something has happened that perhaps we can become numb, which is partly why I'm so glad for this shift and this change, and the fact that young people today are making sure that we don't become young. So my view of all of this is that we have a public health crisis in the United States that most folks aren't fully aware of the seriousness of this public health crisis. It's roughly 8 violent gun deaths an hour, over 90 a day, and that the United States has more gun deaths by homicide, suicide, mass shootings, mass killings, and people don't even speak about all of the gun injuries that occur in the U.S. Again, a little more data. According to the American Journal of Medicine, they did a study in 2016 comparing violent gun deaths in the United States alongside of the combined gun deaths of 22 developed countries. They have 1.5 our population, yet we have 10 times as many gun deaths. And that's for women, children, adults, and so forth. In fact, the rates of gun deaths in the United States, I think, speaking a little bit to what Gianni just said, is similar to the rate of gun deaths in failed states and war-torn countries. That's where we live. Failed states and war-torn countries. I want to say very clearly that there have been attempts to explain away these obvious findings. One approach that's been used is denial, and that's to call these Parkland kids crisis actors. And you know, the Sandy Hook families, and I have to say, as somebody who got to know those families, probably for me what's most upsetting is the way these folks are trolled and threatened, and they're getting calls now to say that they're all fakes, the InfoWars and some of the real fake news that occurs that make the tragedies of those families that much more extreme. I think we all know that the statistics are real. Some other explanations that are used is the idea that violent movies and video games, which is ridiculous because the rest of the developed world has the same video games and violent media that we have, and yet there's not the same level of gun deaths. And then the mental health issues. And the mental health issues are interesting because I certainly support more resources for mental health and more attention to mental health. And also the idea that kids who are upset or angry or depressed or being bullied should get the help they need. But it has nothing to do with the basic issue of gun deaths in this country. Because once again, the rest of the developed world has the same angry young kids, bullied kids, and so forth that we have here. The big difference is the fact that we have the 300 million guns. And there was a sociologist who, not too many years ago, did a correlation looking at gun deaths around the world, and it's just clearly correlated with the availability of guns. The problem here is just about anybody can get as many of whatever type of weapons that they want. And the so-called gun show loophole, which means that about a third of gun purchases are with zero background checks, means that folks can just walk into a show or online or through a private purchase and buy assault weapons. And they can do it impulsively, they're angry, etc. I have to say that that's the problem. It's really quite simple what the problem is. And what's more complex is what we do about it, especially with what I refer to as congressional complicity. There is something called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which makes it almost impossible to sue a gun manufacturer. Just want you to know that right now you could sue just about anybody, anytime, but there's one very small sliver that is a protected class. Why these folks need to be a protected class is obviously because they have effective lobbyists. And then what's referred to as the Dickey Amendment, which makes it almost impossible to do real gun research about gun violence. And this was prohibited, research on gun violence, in 1996, called the Dickey Amendment. There's some thoughts that maybe there's some wiggle room now in Congress, but at this point, I don't believe it. So what are the solutions? Clearly, we need to repeal those amendments. We need to elect leaders who are going to have the guts to repeal that Dickey Amendment and that PLCAA, and then institute gun safety laws that are going to work for us. The two that I feel as though I really need to mention is the background checks for everyone and licensing laws, and that's what Connecticut put into place. That's what also now exists in Maryland, and when Missouri took away those licensing laws, their gun deaths went up. So serious licensing laws, which means that people have to take a class, they have to register those firearms, everything needs to be registered, and I'm just thinking that some of our biggest allies are law enforcement who don't want to walk into a situation where people have automatic weapons that they don't have. So requiring background checks, registering firearms, regulating dealers, requiring the reporting of lost or stolen firearms, which exists in some states but not others. And then obviously this only happens, and it's partly why I'm so pleased to be speaking at this event, this only happens if we elect folks who are willing to defend lives rather than gun manufacturers. So that's what we got to do, and then that the opposition is very well funded and very well organized, and groups like ours are less well organized. So we've got to put up that good fight. Thank you so much.